Sometimes life strips away everything we thought defined us, leaving us desperate in ways we never imagined. In that moment of deepest need, we discover who we truly are and who might still believe in us. A giant Viking warrior named Hrold arrives at a frozen trading post for winter supplies. As night falls, he finds a young woman digging through garbage for scraps of bread. Her name is Thyra, once from a proud merchant family, now left with nothing after raiders destroyed her world. When she sees him watching, she expects shame or cruelty. Instead, Hrold kneels beside her in the snow. What he offers her goes beyond food or shelter. He offers her dignity. But can two outcasts find healing together when the world sees only a fallen woman and a brutish warrior? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trading post of Skjoldheim sat like a weathered sentinel at the mouth of the great fjord, where the icy waters met the endless northern sea. Built from massive pine logs and reinforced with iron bands, it had weathered 40 winters of howling winds and driving snow. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying the mingled scents of wood fires, roasting meat, and the sharp tang of fermented fish that marked every Norse settlement. Hrold the Strong had seen many such posts in his 38 years, but none quite like this one. As his longboat scraped against the wooden dock, he could feel the weight of curious eyes upon him. At nearly 7 feet tall and broad as an oak tree, he commanded attention wherever he went. His beard, streaked with premature silver, hung to his chest in carefully braided plaits, adorned with small iron rings. Scars crisscrossed his massive forearms like a map of old battles, each one a story he rarely chose to tell. The dock creaked under his boots as he stepped ashore, his leather satchel heavy with silver coins and amber pieces for trade. Winter was coming early this year. He could taste it in the air, see it in the way the gulls flew lower and more urgent in their cries. His own settlement, 3 days' sail to the north, would need grain and preserved meat to survive the dark months ahead. More importantly, they would need the specialized ironwork that only Skjoldheim's smiths could provide. Well, if it isn't the mountain walking among men, called Bjorn Ironside, the post's chief trader. The stocky man approached with the careful respect one showed to a customer with deep pockets and deeper scars. "What brings Hrold the Strong to our humble dock?" "The same thing that brings any man with sense this time of year," Hrold replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned that words, like weapons, were most effective when used deliberately. "Winter supplies. My people need grain, salt, and iron tools. I have silver and amber to trade." Bjorn's eyes lit with the gleam that all successful merchants possessed when discussing profitable business. "Ah, you've come at a good time. The harvest was generous this year, and our smiths have been busy through the summer months. Come, let me show you what we have." As they walked toward the main trading hall, Hrold observed the bustling life around him. Children darted between the adults, their laughter cutting through the more serious conversations of commerce. Women tended cooking fires while keeping watchful eyes on their little ones. Craftsmen worked at benches outside their shops, taking advantage of the day's pale sunlight. It was a scene of comfortable prosperity, the kind that came from being positioned at the crossroads of several major trade routes. But prosperity, Hrold knew, could be as fragile as morning frost. He had seen too many settlements like this one reduced to ash and memory by raiders who swept down from the northern wastes like wolves seeking easy prey. The thought made him glance toward the wooden palisade that surrounded the settlement, adequate for keeping out wild animals, but hardly sufficient against determined human predators. Inside the trading hall, the negotiations began in earnest. Bjorn spread samples of grain across a wooden table, each type carefully separated into small clay bowls. The barley was plump and golden, the rye dark and robust. Preserved fish hung in neat rows from the rafters above, their skins glistening with salt and rendered fat. Iron tools lay displayed on another table, axes with keen edges, knives with bone handles, and the specialized fishing hooks that Hrold's people prized above almost any other trade good. "The grain will cost you 3 silver pieces per barrel," Bjorn began, settling into the familiar rhythm of negotiation. "The fish, 2 pieces per string. As for the ironwork, your prices have risen since last season," Hrold observed mildly, picking up one of the fishing hooks and examining its craftsmanship. The iron was good quality, folded and tempered properly, but not exceptional enough to justify premium pricing. Bjorn shrugged with practiced casualness. "Times are harder. The southern routes have been troubled by pirates, and the eastern passes are blocked by early snow. Supply lines that once ran smooth as silk now snag like fishing nets on hidden rocks." This was likely true, but Hrold suspected there was more to it. "There always was. What aren't you telling me, old friend?" The merchant's expression flickered just for a moment, with something that might have been uncertainty. "There have been troubles. Nothing that concerns foreign traders, of course. Local matters only. Local matters have a way of becoming everyone's problems," Hrold said, setting down the hook with deliberate care. "Especially when they involve the kind of troubles that make established traders nervous about their supply lines." Bjorn glanced around the hall, confirming they were alone, except for a young apprentice sorting grain in the corner. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a confidential murmur. "There was a raid 3 moons past. A merchant family, the Ericssons. Their compound was burned. They say it was bandits from the eastern mountains, but..." He shrugged again, this time with genuine uncertainty rather than negotiating posture. "But you don't believe it was bandits," Hrold finished. "The Ericssons were well defended. Old Magnus Ericsson was a warrior before he became a merchant, and his sons knew their way around weapons. It would have taken more than common bandits to overwhelm them so completely." Bjorn paused, seeming to weigh his words. "They found no survivors." "None at all, except..." Hrold prompted, sensing there was more. "There was a daughter, Thyra. She wasn't found among the dead, but she wasn't found among the living either. Some say she escaped. Others say she was taken." Bjorn's voice grew even quieter. "A few claim they've seen her around the settlement, but if so, she's keeping herself well hidden." The conversation turned back to business matters. But something in Bjorn's tale had lodged itself in Hrold's mind like a splinter. Perhaps it was the way the merchant's eyes had shifted when speaking of the missing daughter, or maybe it was his own experiences with loss that made him sensitive to the pain hidden beneath such stories. Whatever the reason, he found himself thinking about a young woman whose world had been swept away in a single night of flames and screaming. The negotiations concluded with a fair price for both parties, though Hrold suspected Bjorn had added a small premium for what he probably considered hazard pay. The goods would be loaded onto his ship by morning, leaving him a night to spend in Skjoldheim's modest inn. As evening settled over the settlement like a familiar cloak, he made his way through streets that grew quieter with each passing hour. The inn was warm and welcoming, its main room filled with the comfortable sounds of conversation and laughter. Hrold claimed a corner table where he could observe the room while keeping his back to the wall, an old habit that had served him well in less friendly establishments. The innkeeper, a cheerful woman named Astrid, brought him roasted mutton and dark bread, along with a horn of ale that had been brewed with enough skill to earn his approval. As the evening wore on, he listened to the conversations around him with the half-attention of a man accustomed to gathering information, even while appearing relaxed. Talk ranged from the usual concerns of any trading settlement, weather, crops, the reliability of various merchant families, but underneath it all, he detected an undercurrent of unease. People spoke in lower voices when discussing travels beyond the settlement's boundaries. They glanced toward the windows more often than seemed natural. They went quiet when strangers approached their tables. It was the behavior of a community that had been reminded, recently and forcefully, that the world beyond their walls was not always kind. When he finally stepped outside into the crisp night air, Hrold intended to return to his ship and prepare for an early departure. Instead, he found himself walking toward the docks, drawn by an impulse he couldn't quite name. The settlement slept around him, windows glowing softly with the light of banked fires. Night watches making their quiet rounds along the palisade. At the water's edge, where his longboat rode gently at anchor, he paused to breathe in the salt, sweet air of the fjord. Tomorrow, he would sail home with full holds and successful trades to report. His people would be well prepared for the winter ahead. It was a good night's work. The kind that brought satisfaction to a man who took his responsibilities seriously. That was when he heard it. A soft sound that didn't belong to the normal symphony of creaking boats and lapping water. A rustling, followed by what might have been a quickly stifled gasp. His warrior's instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile places, brought him to full alertness in an instant. Moving as quietly as his considerable bulk allowed, he followed the sound to its source. Behind a stack of empty barrels, near the fish cleaning station, he found her. She knelt in the refuse, her thin hands moving with desperate efficiency through scraps of bread and fish bones that had been discarded by the day's workers. Her movements spoke of practiced hunger, the kind that came not from missing a single meal, but from missing many. In the pale moonlight, he could see that her clothes had once been fine, wool dyed in deep blue, leather shoes that had been crafted by skilled hands. Now everything hung on her thin frame, like garments meant for someone else, someone who had eaten regular meals and slept in warm beds. When she sensed his presence and looked up, he saw eyes that held no hope of kindness from strangers. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to expect the worst from every human encounter, someone who had been disappointed too many times to dare hope for compassion, but there was something else there too. Something that made him pause rather than simply toss her a coin and continue on his way. Pride, even kneeling in refuse. Even reduced to scavenging for survival, she held her chin at an angle that spoke of inner strength. She was not begging. She was enduring. And in that moment, looking down at this young woman whose dignity remained intact despite her circumstances, Hrold the Strong made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He knelt beside her in the snow, his massive frame settling with surprising gentleness, and spoke words that neither of them would ever forget. "You don't have to do this alone." Thyra, Eriksdottir, froze at the sound of the deep voice, her fingers still clutched around a crust of bread she had pulled from the refuse. The man was enormous, his shoulders blocking out stars, but his eyes held something she had not seen in months, genuine concern. "I am not alone," she said quietly, her voice carrying the careful diction of someone raised in a merchant household. "I am exactly where I choose to be." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Hrold seemed to understand the importance of preserving her dignity. Instead of challenging her words, he settled into his kneeling position, as if they were old friends. "My name is Hrold," he said simply. "What do the stories say about Thyra Eriksdottir?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She had not heard her full name spoken aloud in weeks. To have this stranger speak it with such respect was almost more than she could bear. "The stories say she died with her family," Thyra said finally. "They say Magnus Eriksson's daughter perished in the flames. There is no other story worth telling." "And yet," Hrold said gently, "here you are." The simple observation hung between them like a challenge. Thyra found herself caught between the familiar urge to flee and an unexpected desire to speak truthfully about what had really happened. "I was not at the compound when they came," she heard herself saying. "I had quarreled with my father about a marriage proposal. I rode out to think, to cool my temper before returning to apologize. I saw the smoke from 5 miles away," she continued, her voice growing quieter. "By the time I reached our lands, there was nothing left but ash. My father, my 3 brothers, the servants, all gone. The raiders had vanished like morning mist. But you survived," Hrold said, understanding that survival was not always the blessing others imagined it to be. "I survived," Thyra agreed bitterly. "I returned to Skjoldheim with nothing. I thought my father's friends would help me, that the connections our family had built would mean something." She laughed without humor. I learned quickly that friendship dies with the silver that bought it. When Magnus Eriksson was wealthy, I was a desirable marriage prospect. As a penniless orphan, I became something else entirely. Bjorn Ironside offered me work, she continued. Honest work, he assured me, though his eyes suggested otherwise. Others made similar offers. I soon realized that in their minds I had become a commodity. So you chose this instead, Hrold said, gesturing toward the refuse barrels. I chose to remain myself, Thyra corrected firmly. Whatever the cost, they knelt together in silence for a moment, the sounds of the sleeping settlement around them peaceful in a way that seemed to exist outside of time. I had a sister once, Hrold said finally, his voice carrying old grief, carefully controlled. Her name was Helga. She was murdered by a man who decided her refusal of his marriage. Proposal was an insult that demanded payment. The pain in his voice made Thyra want to offer comfort to this stranger who had shown her such kindness. I tracked him down, Hrold continued. When I confronted him, he claimed it had been an accident, a misunderstanding. His hands slowly curled into fists. I gave him the same choice he had given my sister. None at all. Thyra understood she was looking at a man capable of great violence when circumstances demanded it, but also one who channeled that violence according to a code of honor she could respect. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because when I offer help, it comes with no conditions, Hrold replied. I have seen what happens when good people are forced to impossible choices. He withdrew a cloth bundle from his satchel, setting it between them. Inside was real bread, cheese, and dried meat. The sight of actual food made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. I'm not asking you to trust me, he continued, but I am asking you to accept that there are still people who help others simply because help is needed. Thyra stared at the food, her pride warring with her body's need. She had not eaten properly in days. What would you want in return? She asked. Nothing, he said simply. Though if you're willing to answer a question, I would be grateful. What question? The night your family was killed. Did you see anything that might tell us who was responsible? The question surprised her. No one had asked for details about what she had witnessed. I saw the smoke, she said slowly. But there was something else. I passed a group of riders heading away from our lands. 6 men moving fast. They were well equipped, good horses, quality weapons. These were not desperate bandits. They moved like soldiers. Professional raiders, Hrold said grimly. Men who kill for pay. But who would pay to have my family murdered? We had no enemies that would justify such violence. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones you don't recognize, Hrold replied. Before Thyra could respond, she heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose toward their location. In an instant, she was on her feet, every instinct screaming at her to run. But Hrold's massive hand gently touched her arm, not restraining but steadying. Wait, he said quietly, his head tilted as he listened to the approaching sounds. These are not random passers-by. 3 men emerged from the shadows between the buildings, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of planning rather than chance encounter. Thyra recognized them immediately. Olaf the shipwright, Eric Ironbeard, and Gunnar the blacksmith's son. All respectable members of the community, all men who had known her family, all men who now looked at her with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to predatory. Well, Olaf said, his voice carrying a false joviality that made Thyra's skin crawl. What do we have here? The fallen daughter of Magnus Eriksson, finally accepting the charity she's too proud to ask for properly. It's not charity she's been seeking, Eric added with a meaningful glance at Hrold. Word travels quickly in a settlement this size. They say she's been offering herself to travelers in exchange for food and coin. The lie hit Thyra like a physical blow. But before she could protest, Hrold rose to his full height, his presence suddenly filling the space around them like a gathering storm. I would be very careful about the next words you speak, he said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that made all 3 men take an involuntary step backward. Because I have just spent time in conversation with this young woman. And I can assure you that your implications are both false and deeply insulting. Gunnar, either braver or more foolish than his companions, stepped forward with a sneer. And what would a foreign warrior know about our local troubles? Thyra Eriksdottir lost her right to respectability when she lost her family's protection. She's fair game now, and everyone knows it. What happened next occurred so quickly that Thyra barely had time to process it. One moment Gunnar was standing 3 feet away, smirking at Hrold, with the confidence of a man backed by friends and local opinion. The next moment he was pinned against the nearest building. Hrold's forearm pressed against his throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult but not impossible. "Let me make something very clear," Hrold said, in a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been. "This woman is under my protection. Anyone who approaches her with dishonorable intentions will answer to me personally. Anyone who spreads lies about her character will find themselves explaining their words to my blade. Do we understand each other?" The other 2 men began backing away, clearly having no desire to test whether Hrold's reputation for violence was deserved. But Gunnar, trapped against the wall, managed to wheeze out a response. "You can't protect her forever, stranger. When you sail away, she'll still be here, and we'll still remember what she is." Hrold's expression grew even more dangerous. "Then perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "she won't be staying here much longer." The words surprised Thyra as much as they did the 3 men. She stared at Hrold's profile, wondering if she had heard him correctly, wondering if this giant warrior was truly suggesting what she thought he was suggesting. "Now," Hrold continued, releasing Gunnar but remaining close enough to grab him again if necessary, "I suggest you 3 find somewhere else to spend your evening, and I strongly recommend that you spread word throughout this settlement that Thyra Eriksdottir has friends who take a very personal interest in her welfare." The men departed quickly, Gunnar rubbing his throat and shooting venomous looks back at both Hrold and Thyra. When they were gone, silence settled over the docks once more. But it was a different kind of silence now, charged with possibility and weighted with unspoken questions. "You said I wouldn't be staying here much longer," Thyra said finally. "What did you mean?" Hrold turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw a decision being made in real time. A choice that would alter the course of both their lives. "I meant," he said carefully, "that if you're willing, there's a place for you in my settlement. Honest work, fair treatment, and people who will judge you by your character rather than your circumstances. And if I'm not willing, then I'll make sure you have enough supplies to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere far from the small minds and smaller hearts of this place." He paused, studying her face in the moonlight. "But I hope you'll consider the first option. My people could use someone with your intelligence and strength." As Thyra looked into the face of this unexpected protector, she realized that her world had just shifted on its axis once again. But this time, instead of losing everything, she might finally have found something worth keeping. Dawn came slowly to Skjoldheim, creeping across the fjord waters like a cautious cat. Thyra had not slept. She sat on old fishing nets near the docks, watching the first merchants begin their routines. The bread and cheese had been the most satisfying meal she'd eaten in months. But it was the offer of a new life that kept her mind spinning through the dark hours. Hrold's longboat bobbed at anchor, its dragon-headed prow catching the early light. She could see him aboard, preparing for departure. Part of her expected him to sail away with the morning tide, leaving her with nothing but a memory of unexpected kindness. But as the sun climbed higher, she saw him walking toward her, carrying something that made her breath catch, a cloak. Deep blue wool lined with rabbit fur. "I thought you might need this," he said, settling beside her. "The mornings are cold on the water, and the journey to my settlement takes 3 days." Thyra stared at the cloak, recognizing quality workmanship. The wool was finely woven, the fur lining soft and thick. It was the kind of garment a wealthy merchant's daughter might wear. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "I commissioned it from the seamstress this morning," Hrold replied. "Paid her double to have it ready before the tide turned." The casual mention of paying double struck her like a revelation. This was not charity driven by pity. This was investment, preparation, the actions of someone who intended to follow through on his promises. "I haven't said yes yet," she pointed out. "No," Hrold agreed. "But you're still here, and you ate the food I offered." Those seemed like the actions of someone considering her options. She couldn't argue with his logic. If she'd truly intended to decline, she would have vanished before dawn. Instead, she'd spent the night imagining what it might be like to belong somewhere again. "Tell me about your settlement," she said, pulling the cloak around her shoulders. "It's called Raven's Hollow," Hrold said, his voice taking on the tone men used when speaking of home. "Sits in a protected valley. Good farmland, streams, timber, about 200 souls. What would I do there? That depends on your skills. You understand trade, numbers, record-keeping. Our ledger keeper is getting old. Or perhaps you'd prefer working with the women. Wool work pays well." The possibilities were practical, respectful. No mention of marriage obligations or earning her place through anything other than honest labor. And the people there, what would they be told about me? That you're a skilled woman from a merchant family who has agreed to join our community. That you have my endorsement and protection. Beyond that, your story is yours to tell. The simple respect in his words was perhaps more valuable than the cloak or food. He was giving her the chance to control her own narrative. "There's something else," Hrold continued. "The men who confronted us last night represent an attitude that exists in many settlements. The idea that a woman without male protection is fair game. In Raven's Hollow, such thinking is not tolerated, because you forbid it. Because the community as a whole rejects it," he corrected. "I'm not their king, Thyra. I'm simply a man they respect. When I say something is not tolerated, it's because I'm expressing a view most of our people already share." This distinction was important, and Thyra appreciated the clarification. She would not be trading one form of dependence for another. A commotion from the trading post interrupted them. Voices raised in anger, something heavy hitting the ground. Bjorn Ironside appeared at the dock's end, his face red with fury. Behind him came the 3 men from the previous night, along with several other merchants. "There she is," Gunnar called out, pointing at Thyra. "The whore who's been spreading lies about honest men." The accusation was so false that Thyra could only stare in shock. She had spoken to no one except Hrold, had made no accusations, had done nothing but exist. But as she looked at the angry faces approaching, she realized that truth was less important to them than maintaining their sense of righteous grievance. They needed her to be the villain in this story. Hrold rose to his feet, positioning himself slightly in front of Thyra. His hand rested easily on his sword pommel. "Bjorn," he said calmly, "you seem distressed. Perhaps we can discuss this like civilized men." "Civilized?" Bjorn's voice cracked with indignation. "You call it civilized to threaten respected members of our community over a woman who has no standing?" "I call it civilized to treat all people with basic decency," Hrold replied. "And I call it uncivilized to harass a woman simply because she lacks resources to defend herself." "She's been stealing," Eric declared. "Taking food from the merchant's refuse, making our settlement look bad to visitors." The absurdity of the charge, that scavenging thrown-away food constituted theft, would have been laughable under other circumstances. But some of the gathered men were nodding in agreement, finding logic in the twisted reasoning that made her survival a crime. "If that's your concern," Hrold said mildly, "then I have excellent news. Thyra will be leaving Skjoldheim this morning, traveling with me to begin a new life in Raven's Hollow. Your refuse will be safe from her depredations." His words carried just enough subtle mockery to make several men flush with anger, but not enough to constitute an outright insult that would demand formal response. But Gunnar wasn't ready to be dismissed so easily. And what guarantee that this foreign warrior won't tire of his new toy and send her back to plague us again? The word toy hung in the air like a drawn blade. Thyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from pure rage at being discussed as if she were an object rather than a person. Before she could respond, Hrold's voice cut through the morning air with finality. "The same guarantee I gave you last night," he said, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. "Anyone who treats this woman with disrespect will answer to me personally. And that guarantee, Gunner, extends to anyone who refers to her in such terms again." The tension stretched between the two groups like a taut rope. Thyra could see the calculation in Bjorn's eyes, weighing the potential profit of maintaining good relations with a wealthy foreign trader against the satisfaction of putting an uppity woman in her place. "You're making a mistake," Bjorn said finally. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble." "That," Hrold replied with quiet certainty, "is my risk to take." As she watched the confrontation unfold, Thyra realized that her decision had already been made. Not by Hrold's offer of safety and work, generous though it was, but by the simple fact that he had consistently treated her as a person worthy of respect. In a world that seemed determined to reduce her to nothing more than a cautionary tale or a convenient target, that respect was the most valuable thing anyone could offer. She stood slowly, the new cloak settling around her shoulders like armor, and stepped forward to stand beside Hrold. The gesture was small but unmistakable. She was choosing her side in this confrontation, choosing to trust in the possibility of a better future rather than accepting the limitations others wanted to impose on her. "I accept your offer," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the dock for everyone to hear. "I will come with you to Raven's Hollow." The words felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that there would be solid ground somewhere below. But as she looked into Hrold's face and saw the quiet satisfaction there, she thought perhaps this leap of faith might finally carry her somewhere worth landing. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, Thyra Eriksdottir, daughter of merchants, survivor of tragedy, and a woman who had finally found someone willing to help her reclaim her dignity. The departure from Skjoldheim felt like awakening from a long, troubled dream. As Hrold's longboat cut through the morning waters, Thyra sat wrapped in her new cloak and watched the trading post grow smaller behind them. The familiar buildings that had been both sanctuary and prison dwindled to toy-like structures, then disappeared entirely around a bend. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Thyra allowed herself to breathe deeply without fear that someone might be watching, judging, planning to take advantage of her vulnerability. The sensation was so foreign that it took her several minutes to recognize what she was feeling. Peace. "Are you having second thoughts?" Hrold asked from his position at the steering oar. "No," Thyra replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I was just thinking how strange it feels to look forward instead of constantly glancing over my shoulder." The longboat was well crafted, built for both cargo and speed. Besides Hrold, there were two other men aboard, his crew members Eric Whitehair and Magnus Ironarm, both grizzled veterans who had greeted Thyra with respectful nods. They worked with easy competence, adjusting sail and checking cargo with minimal conversation. Thyra found herself studying the trade goods that filled the hold, her merchant's training automatically cataloguing what she saw. Quality ironwork, barrels of grain, salt-packed fish, bolts of fine wool, all the materials that would see Raven's Hollow through the coming winter. "Tell me more about your people," she said. Settling against a stack of grain sacks, Hrold considered the question as he adjusted their course. "Practical mostly. We get enough travelers that strangers aren't unusual, but not so many that we've grown careless. They'll be curious about you, but not intrusive. And your sister, Astrid?" A smile softened Hrold's weathered features. 2 years younger than me, but twice as stubborn. Lost her husband 3 winters past, but refused all offers to marry again. Says she'd rather weave her own cloth than mend another man's socks. She runs the Women's Wool Cooperative and somehow finds time to help raise her sister-in-law's children. The description painted a picture of a strong, independent woman who had carved out her own place despite personal loss. Thyra felt anticipation at the thought of meeting someone who might understand, rebuilding a life after tragedy. "What about leadership in Raven's Hollow?" "We have a council of elders," Hrold explained. 5 people chosen by general agreement, serving 3-year terms. I sit on it currently, along with Astrid, old Henrik the law speaker. Tormund, who manages trade, and Sigrid the healer. Most decisions are made by consensus. This democratic approach was more progressive than Thyra had expected. The idea of shared leadership, including women in authority, suggested a community that valued wisdom over mere strength. As they sailed northward, the landscape grew wilder and more beautiful. Steep cliffs rose from the water's edge, carved by countless years of wind and waves. Seabirds nested in rocky crevices, their cries echoing across the water. "It's magnificent," Thyra said, watching an eagle soar above their mast. "Wait until you see the valley," Eric Whitehair called from the bow. Prettiest sight in the Northlands. The easy camaraderie between the men was evident, built on years of shared experiences. But Thyra noticed they included her naturally in their conversation, not treating her as an outsider to be tolerated. As the morning progressed, the wind strengthened, filling their sail and pushing them swiftly through the water. Thyra discovered she had her sea legs. The boat's motion felt natural rather than unsettling. "You've sailed before," Hrold observed. "Many times." "With my father on trading voyages," Thyra replied, feeling the familiar pang that came with any mention of her family. "He believed I should understand all aspects of the business. A wise man," Hrold said simply, and his matter-of-fact acknowledgement felt more comforting than elaborate sympathy would have been. The memory led to others, and Thyra found herself talking about her family in a way she hadn't been able to since their deaths. She spoke of her father's patient teaching, her brother's rivalry, the security of being part of something larger than herself. For the first time, she could remember them with more joy than pain. "They sound like people worth remembering," Hrold said when she fell quiet. "They were. I think they would approve of this choice. What makes you doubt it?" Thyra considered seriously. "My father taught me to be self-reliant, never to become dependent on others' goodwill. This feels like both wisdom and dependence at once." "Perhaps," Hrold suggested. "The difference lies in whether you're accepting help to avoid responsibility, or to regain the ability to take responsibility for yourself." His insight was so accurate that Thyra felt something settle in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She was not abandoning her principles. She was using his help as a bridge back to who she wanted to be. The conversation was interrupted by Magnus calling from the bow. "Settlement ahead." Fishing boats coming in. Thyra saw a cluster of buildings nestled in a protected cove, smoke rising from chimneys. It was the first settlement since leaving Skjoldheim. "This is Grimsby," Hrold explained. "We stop here sometimes for supplies. Good people, but they've had troubles lately." As they approached, Thyra could see the tension in how people moved, the wariness in how they watched the longboat. Even recognizing Hrold's crew, their greetings seemed subdued. "What kind of troubles?"
she asked. "Raiders," Eric answered grimly.
"Hit them twice in the past month."
"Nothing like what happened to your family. These were after quick plunder, but it's left people nervous." They pulled up to the dock where Hakon the harbour master met them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hrold the Strong," he called out. "Good to see you, though I wish the times were calmer. How fares Grimsby?" Hrold replied, stepping onto the dock. "Well enough, considering. No more uninvited guests, but everyone sleeps lighter these days." Hakon's eyes moved to Thyra with polite curiosity. "And who might this be?" "Thyra, Eric's daughter," Hrold said, helping her from the boat. "She's joining our settlement." Hakon's expression shifted as he recognized the name. "Eric's daughter? Magnus Eriksson's daughter? From the trading family that was—" He trailed off uncomfortably. "Yes," Thyra said simply, lifting her chin. "My condolences. Your father was an honorable man and fair trader. We dealt with him many times." As they talked on the dock with afternoon shadows growing long, Thyra found herself thinking not about the past or uncertain future, but about this moment of transition. For the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The conversation with Hakon took an unexpected turn when the harbour master glanced around nervously and lowered his voice. "There's something else you should know, Hrold. Something we haven't told other traders." Thyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. She watched as Hrold's expression grew serious, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his weapon. "What is it?" Hrold asked. "The raiders who hit us, they knew things," Hakon said quietly. "Things they shouldn't have known. Which families had the most silver, where we store winter reserves, even which boats would be fishing when. It wasn't random plundering. It was planned." Eric and Magnus had drawn closer, their casual demeanor replaced by focused attention. Thyra realized she was witnessing more than idle conversation. This was an intelligence briefing. "You're saying someone gave them information," Hrold said. "I'm saying they had help from someone who knows Grimsby very well," Hakon replied. "Someone who lives here or visits regularly." The implications hung heavy in the salt air. Thyra found herself thinking of her own family's destruction, remembering the professional efficiency of the raiders she had glimpsed. "Have you shared this suspicion with anyone else?" Hrold asked. Hakon shook his head. "Who can we trust? If someone in Grimsby is working with raiders, we don't know who." Thyra spoke for the first time since introductions. "May I ask what they took? Specifically?" Both men looked at her with surprise, but Hrold nodded encouragingly. "Silver mostly," Hakon replied. "Some weapons, food stores, fine cloth. But they left behind things other raiders would have taken: iron tools, amber jewelry, even grain. As if they knew exactly what they wanted." "That's not random raiding," Thyra said quietly. "That's contract work." The three men stared at her. Hrold was the first to speak. "What do you mean?" "My father dealt with mercenaries sometimes," Thyra explained. "He taught me to recognize the difference between desperate criminals and professional soldiers working for pay." She paused, marshalling her thoughts. "Desperate criminals take everything they can carry. Professional mercenaries take what they're paid to take, nothing more. It reduces risk and keeps their employers happy." Hakon's face had gone pale. "You think someone hired raiders to attack Grimsby specifically?" "I think someone hired raiders to get specific things from Grimsby," Thyra corrected. "The question is whether they wanted the goods for their own use, or whether they were trying to weaken your settlement for some other purpose." "But who would benefit from Grimsby being weakened?" Eric asked. Thyra found herself thinking through the implications, her merchant's training automatically analyzing the situation. "Who are your competitors?" she asked Hakon. "Other settlements that might want your fishing grounds, your trade routes?" "Several," Hakon admitted reluctantly. "Nordvik to the south has always resented our harbor fees. Ironhold to the east has been trying to cut us out of deals we've handled for generations. And then there's been talk that some southern jarls are looking to expand northward." Thyra felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align. What if it's not about Grimsby specifically? What if your settlement was just a test? All three men looked at her with sharp attention. "Think about it," she continued. "If someone wanted to gauge the effectiveness of hired raiders, they'd need a target valuable enough to be worth the effort, but not so important that failure would ruin larger plans. Grimsby is prosperous and well defended, but not essential to regional stability." "A proving ground," Hrold said slowly. "Test the raiders' capabilities, refine their methods." "Exactly. And once they've perfected their approach." Thyra didn't need to finish the sentence. Hakon looked sick. "You think they're planning something bigger?" "I think professional raiders don't work cheap. And whoever hired them probably has larger ambitions than stealing silver from fishing villages." The group fell into troubled silence. Thyra found herself thinking about her family's fate with new understanding. Had the Eriksson compound been another test? "There's something else," she said suddenly, a memory surfacing. "The night my family was killed, I saw the raiders leaving. 6 men, but also something that didn't seem important at the time." She paused, calling up details of that terrible night. "They were leading pack horses, more animals than they would have needed for goods from a single raid. As if they were prepared to hit multiple targets." Hrold's expression grew grim. "Or as if they were working their way through a list that might include Raven's Hollow." Magnus said quietly. "We need to warn your people." Hakon said urgently. "We will," Hrold agreed. "But first we need to understand what we're facing. Thyra, is there anything else you remember that might help identify who's behind this?" Thyra closed her eyes, forcing herself to relive those horrible moments. The memory was painful, but she pushed through it, searching for crucial details. Their gear was matched, she said finally. Not just quality equipment, but specifically matched. Same style armor, similar weapons, horses that looked like they came from the same breeding lines. That level of uniformity costs money and requires organization. Military organization, Eric observed. There's one more thing, Thyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. I recognized one of the horses. The silence that followed was complete. What do you mean, recognized? Hrold asked gently. A stallion with distinctive markings, white blaze down the face, 3 white socks. My father had been negotiating to buy that horse from a trader named Sven Blacktooth. We'd seen it several times at different markets. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Hrold. The last time I saw that horse before the night my family died, it was in Sven Blacktooth's string at the Skjoldheim summer market. He was asking 3 times normal price, claiming it was trained for war. And now you're telling us one of the raiders was riding it, Hrold said, his voice carrying deadly quiet. I'm telling you that either Sven Blacktooth sold a very expensive horse to raiders, or did... She let the implication hang unspoken. Or Sven Blacktooth is working with the raiders, Hakon finished. The revelation changed everything. They now had a specific target for investigation, a thread they could follow back to whoever was orchestrating these attacks. As they stood on the dock with afternoon shadows growing longer, Thyra realized that her new life in Ravenshollow might be interrupted before it could begin. The past she thought she was leaving behind had caught up with her. The journey to Ravenshollow had become a race against time, with stakes extending far beyond their personal hopes for the future. They departed Grimsby with urgency replacing the leisurely pace of their earlier sailing. Hrold had purchased additional supplies, not the comfortable provisions of a trading voyage, but the practical necessities of a settlement preparing for siege. Extra arrows, preserved meat that would keep indefinitely, medicinal herbs that Sigrid the healer would need if people were wounded. As their longboat cut through increasingly rough waters, Thyra found herself studying a piece of parchment that Hakon had pressed into her hands before they left. It was a crude map, showing the locations of recent raids, marked with dates and details of what had been taken. The pattern was becoming clearer with each mile they traveled north. They're working their way up the coast systematically, she said, tracing the progression with her finger. Each target slightly larger and more prosperous than the last. Each raid teaching them something new about how to overcome defenses. Hrold glanced at the map over her shoulder. And Ravenshollow is the logical next step. More than that, Thyra said grimly. It's the prize they've been preparing to claim. Everything else has been practice. The wind had picked up, bringing with it the scent of distant snow and the promise of an early winter. Eric and Magnus worked efficiently to adjust their sail, but their usual easy banter had been replaced by the focused silence of men preparing for war. Tell me about your defenses, Thyra said to Hrold. Not just the physical barriers, but the people. Who would fight if raiders came calling? Hrold was quiet for a long moment, clearly running through the settlement's population in his mind. Most of the adults have some fighting experience. We're not warriors by profession, but we're not defenseless farmers either. The men who work the mines know their way around picks and axes. The fishermen are strong and used to working together under dangerous conditions. And the women... Astrid can shoot a bow better than most men I know. Several of the others have similar skills. In a crisis, we could probably field 40 or 50 people capable of meaningful resistance. Thyra nodded, doing quick calculations in her head. Against 6 professional raiders with inside information and proven tactics, that should be sufficient. But if they bring more men, or if they have support from within your settlement, she didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood that numbers alone wouldn't guarantee victory against enemies who had already demonstrated their ability to overcome larger forces. There's something else we need to consider, Magnus said from his position at the bow. These raiders have been successful because they've had time to plan, to gather intelligence, to choose their moment. What if we could take away those advantages? Eric looked up from adjusting a rope. You mean strike first? I mean make them react to us instead of letting them set the terms, Magnus replied. If we can identify Sven Blacktooth's location, if we can gather evidence of his involvement with the raiders, we might be able to disrupt their operation before they can move against Raven's Hollow. Thyra felt a surge of something that might have been anticipation or fear. She wasn't sure which. You're talking about hunting them instead of waiting to be hunted. I'm talking about taking control of the situation, Magnus said firmly. I've spent too many years waiting for other people's wars to come to me. Sometimes the best defense is making sure your enemies are too busy dealing with their own problems to focus on attacking you. Hrold's expression was thoughtful. It's risky. If we're wrong about Sven Blacktooth, if we move against him without sufficient evidence, we could find ourselves branded as the aggressors. And if we're right but we wait too long to act, Thyra said quietly, we could find ourselves burying our friends and family the way I buried mine. The stark reminder of what they were really fighting to prevent settled over the group like a shroud. None of them wanted to be the survivors, standing over the ashes of everything they held dear, wondering if there had been something more they could have done. As the day wore on, they refined their understanding of the threat and began developing a plan to address it. Thyra's knowledge of trading networks and Hrold's familiarity with the region's political landscape proved invaluable in mapping out where Sven Blacktooth might be found and how they might approach him. Without triggering a larger conflict, he'll be somewhere he can monitor traffic without drawing attention, Thyra said, studying the coastal geography. Traders like Sven need to see who's moving what, where the opportunities are, but they also need to be able to disappear quickly if questions are asked. Crow's Nest Bay, Eric suggested. It's got good anchorage, multiple escape routes, and it's positioned where he could watch traffic from 3 different trade routes. Hrold nodded slowly. It's also far enough from any major settlement that he could conduct business without official oversight. They were interrupted by a shout from Magnus, who was pointing toward the western horizon. Smoke signal! Thyra squinted against the afternoon glare and saw it. A thin column of dark smoke rising from what appeared to be an island or coastal promontory several miles away. It was too controlled, too deliberate to be accidental. That's coming from Beacon Point, Hrold said, his voice tight with concern. The watchtower that guards the approach to Raven's Hollow. Is that good news or bad news? Thyra asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Depends on the signal pattern, Eric replied grimly. 1 fire means all clear. 2 fires mean traders or other peaceful visitors approaching. 3 fires mean he didn't need to finish. They could all see that this was a single column of smoke, but it was too dark and too sustained to be the casual signal of routine watchkeeping. Something's wrong, Hrold said flatly. We need to get there immediately. The next few hours tested every skill they possessed as sailors. The wind had turned contrary, forcing them to tack back and forth across increasingly choppy waters. What should have been a straight run to Raven's Hollow became a challenging navigation exercise, made more difficult by the urgency that drove them forward. As they drew closer to Beacon Point, they could see that the watchtower was intact, and the signal fire was being maintained by someone who knew proper procedures. But there were no answering signals from the settlement beyond, no indication that anyone in Raven's Hollow was aware of their approach. That's not right, Magnus muttered. They should have responded to our sail by now. Thyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. In her experience, settlements that failed to respond to approaching visitors were settlements that couldn't respond because something had happened. To the people who should have been watching as they rounded the final point of land that would bring Raven's Hollow into view, Thyra found herself holding her breath. Part of her expected to see smoke and devastation, another family settlement reduced to ash by professional killers. But what she saw instead was somehow more unsettling. Raven's Hollow appeared completely normal. Smoke rose from chimneys, boats bobbed peacefully at anchor in the harbor. People moved about their business as if nothing unusual had happened. From this distance, it looked like the prosperous, peaceful settlement that Hrold had described to her. But something was wrong. Thyra couldn't identify what exactly, but her instincts, sharpened by months of survival in hostile circumstances, were screaming warnings. "Do you see it?" she asked Hrold quietly. "See what?" he replied, but his hand had moved to his weapon without conscious thought. "I don't know," Thyra admitted, "but something's not right." As they approached the harbor, she began to understand what had triggered her unease. The settlement looked normal, but it looked too normal. People were going about their daily routines with a mechanical precision that seemed forced, as if they were performing their usual tasks while acutely aware of being watched. "We're sailing into a trap," she said with sudden certainty. Hrold's jaw tightened. "How can you be sure?" "Because I've lived in a settlement under threat," Thyra replied. "I know what it looks like when people are afraid, but trying not to show it. Your people know something's wrong, but they're pretending everything is fine. The question is, what are they pretending for?" The answer to that question would determine whether they could save Hrold's people or whether they were about to join them as captives of enemies who had already proven their ability to turn prosperous communities into graveyards. As their boat drew closer to the dock, Thyra realized that the skills her father had taught her for reading market conditions and assessing trading partners were about to be tested in ways he had never intended. The peaceful-looking harbor ahead of them might be the most dangerous place any of them had ever entered. The truth hit Thyra like a physical blow as their longboat entered Raven's Hollow's harbor. She saw Astrid among the people gathered at the dock, recognizing her instantly from Hrold's description, a woman with the same strong jaw and steady eyes as her brother. But Astrid's expression wasn't one of joy at seeing Hrold return. It was a carefully controlled mask of warning. More telling still was the positioning of the crowd. They stood in small, scattered groups, rather than the natural cluster of people eager to greet returning travelers. Between each group, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, stood men who didn't quite fit. Their clothes were right for the settlement, their poses casual, but their eyes moved with the calculated awareness of professional soldiers. "The raiders are already here," Thyra whispered to Hrold. "They're not planning an attack, they've already taken control." Hrold's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering oar. "How many?" Thyra counted quickly, her merchant's eye for detail serving her well. "I can see at least 8 who don't belong, probably more out of sight. They're trying to make everything appear normal while they consolidate control, which means they want something more than simple plunder," Magnus said grimly. "If they just wanted to raid and leave, they wouldn't need this kind of subterfuge." As they drew closer to the dock, Thyra could see the strain on familiar faces, people trying to maintain normal routines while living under the threat of violence. Children stayed close to their parents. Women kept their eyes downcast. Men moved with the careful deliberation of those who knew. They were being watched for any sign of resistance. A figure emerged. From the trading hall that dominated the settlement center, a man Thyra recognized, with a shock of cold recognition. Sven Blacktooth himself, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of being a simple horse trader. He wore a mail shirt under his cloak and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Hrold the Strong returns," Sven called out in a voice that carried false joviality. "And bringing guests, I see. How wonderful that you've arrived in time for our negotiations." The word negotiations was spoken with enough emphasis to make its true meaning clear. This wasn't a raid in the traditional sense. It was a carefully orchestrated takeover, planned and executed with the precision of a military campaign. Hrold stepped onto the dock with deliberate calm, his massive frame radiating controlled tension. "Sven Blacktooth, I didn't expect to find you in Raven's Hollow, especially not looking so comfortable." "Oh, I'm very comfortable here," Sven replied, his smile never wavering. "Your people have been most accommodating. We've been having such productive discussions about trade agreements, mutual protection, that sort of thing." Thyra followed Hrold onto the dock, acutely aware of the armed men positioned throughout the crowd. She caught Astrid's eye and saw the older woman's minute nod of acknowledgement, a signal that conveyed both recognition and desperate hope. And what sort of protection are you offering? Hrold asked, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet that Thyra had learned to recognize. The best kind, Sven said smoothly. Protection from the very raids that have been troubling settlements up and down this coast. For a reasonable tribute, of course. Think of it as insurance against unfortunate accidents. The extortion scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Sven's raiders had spent months building their reputation through carefully targeted attacks. Now they could move into settlements not as conquerors, but as protectors, demanding payment for safety from threats they themselves had created. And if we refuse your generous offer? Hrold asked. Sven's smile widened, revealing teeth that had given him his nickname, several molars capped with black iron in a display of ostentatious wealth. Well, that would be unfortunate. These are dangerous times, after all. Raiders strike without warning, showing no mercy to those who can't defend themselves. The threat was clear, but it was the implications that made Thyra's blood run cold. This wasn't just about Ravenshollow. Sven was establishing a protection racket that could spread to every settlement in the region. Pay tribute or face destruction, and with his proven track record of successful raids, few communities would dare refuse. But there was something else. Something that didn't quite fit with the extortion theory. Sven's men were too numerous, too well-equipped for a simple shakedown operation. They were positioned like soldiers expecting a siege, not bandits collecting tribute. You're not here for tribute, Thyra said suddenly, her merchant's instincts finally identifying what had been nagging at her. You're here for something else entirely. Sven's attention shifted to her with sudden intensity. Ah, the mysterious woman who's been asking uncomfortable questions about recent business ventures. Thyra Eriksdottir, if I'm not mistaken. The fact that he knew her name confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't a chance encounter or an opportunistic raid. They had been expected, their arrival planned for and prepared against. You've been very inconvenient, Sven continued conversationally. Survivors have such a troublesome habit of remembering details that are better forgotten. Distinctive horses, for instance. Professional equipment. The sorts of things that might lead curious people to ask awkward questions. So this is about eliminating witnesses, Hrold said, his hand moving fractionally closer to his sword. This is about completing a contract, Sven corrected. You see, when certain powerful people decide they want certain territories to become available for new management, they sometimes require the services of specialists. People who can remove inconvenient obstacles to land acquisition. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The raids hadn't been random acts of violence or even systematic extortion. They had been part of a land grab, a campaign to depopulate and demoralize settlements so they could be claimed by whoever was paying Sven's fees. Someone wants to expand their holdings, Thyra said, her voice tight with controlled rage. They're using you to clear away the people already living here. Such a clever girl, Sven said approvingly. Yes, there are those who see great potential in these northern lands. Rich fishing grounds, valuable timber, strategic harbors, all currently occupied by stubborn people who lack the vision to see the greater good that could be achieved with proper management. And Ravenshollow is the prize, Magnus said from behind them. Large enough to serve as a regional center, prosperous enough to be worth the effort. Precisely. My employer has plans for this settlement, plans that don't include its current residents maintaining any form of independence or self-governance. The revelation transformed their understanding of everything that had happened. The Eriksson family massacre, the raids on smaller settlements, even the current occupation of Ravenshollow, all part of a coordinated campaign to seize control of the entire northern coastal region. But there's been a complication, Sven continued, his smile becoming predatory. The daughter of Magnus Eriksson survived when she should have died. Worse, she's been gathering intelligence and asking questions. My employer doesn't like loose ends, so you took Ravenshollow hostage to lure us here, Hrold said. I took Ravenshollow because it was always the objective, Sven corrected. Luring you here was simply a convenient way to tie up remaining loose ends while completing the primary mission. Thyra felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her survival had put Hrold's people in danger. Her questions had accelerated Sven's timeline, forcing him to move against Ravenshollow before his plans were fully mature, but it had also revealed the true scope of the threat they faced. This wasn't just about surviving a raid or escaping a group of bandits. They were confronting an organized campaign to reshape the political landscape of the entire region, backed by resources and planning that went far beyond what any individual settlement could resist. "Who's paying you?" Thyra asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Sven's smile became genuinely amused. "Someone with enough vision to see the potential of these lands and enough resources to realize that vision. Someone who understands that sometimes you have to clear away the old to make room for the new, and enough ruthlessness to commission mass murder." Hrold said flatly. "Progress always requires sacrifice," Sven replied with a shrug. "The question now is whether you want to make this easy or difficult. Surrender quietly and your people die quickly. Resist," and he gestured toward the settlement around them. "Well, fires spread so quickly in wooden buildings. Accidents happen." The threat was clear, but Thyra could see something else in the positioning of Sven's men, something that gave her a spark of desperate hope. They were spread throughout the settlement, trying to control too much territory with too few people. They had the advantage of surprise and superior equipment, but they were vulnerable to coordinated resistance. More importantly, she could see the signs of barely controlled rage in the faces of Ravenshollow's people. These weren't defeated farmers cowering before superior force. These were proud folk who were waiting for a signal, a chance to fight back against the invaders who had taken their home. The question was whether she and Hrold could provide that signal without getting everyone killed in the process. As she looked around the harbor at the faces of people whose only crime had been living in a place someone else wanted to claim, Thyra realized that her merchant's training was about to be tested in the ultimate negotiation, one where the stakes were measured in lives rather than silver, and failure meant the destruction of everything worth preserving. The standoff on the dock stretched like a taut rope, everyone aware that the next word spoken could determine whether Ravenshollow survived the day. Thyra could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Sven's raiders, calculating distances and angles of attack, Hrold's people desperately seeking some sign of hope, and Hrold himself radiating the controlled tension of a man preparing for violence. But Thyra's mind was working on a different level, processing the tactical situation with the same analytical skills she had once applied to market negotiations. Sven had made a mistake in his moment of triumph. He had revealed too much about his operation, his methods, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. "You said your employer has plans for this settlement," she said to Sven, her voice carrying the tone of genuine curiosity rather than defiance. "Plans that require its current residents to be removed. But that's not entirely accurate, is it?" Sven's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a trap but unable to identify its nature. "You need some of the residents to survive," Thyra continued, warming to her analysis. "Someone has to maintain the fishing boats, tend the sheep, work the mines. You can't run a settlement with mercenaries alone. They're too expensive, and they don't have the specialized skills needed for actual production." "Your point?" Sven asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to see where her logic was leading. "My point is that you're not here to eliminate everyone. You're here to eliminate the leadership, the people who might organize resistance or remember how things used to be. You need the settlement to remain functional, which means you need most of these people alive and cooperative." Thyra gestured toward the crowd of Ravenshollow residents. "Which means you're in a more precarious position than you've been pretending. If we fight back and enough of your targets escape, your employer won't have the compliant workforce he's paying for. And if too many people die in the fighting, he won't have a viable settlement to rule." She could see the impact of her words in the subtle shift of posture among Sven's men. They had been confident in their overwhelming advantage, But now they were being reminded that their mission had constraints that limited their options. Clever, Sven admitted, but ultimately irrelevant. I have enough men to control this situation, regardless of how many inconvenient witnesses might prefer to resist. Do you? Hrold asked quietly, and there was something in his tone that made several of Sven's raiders glance around. Nervously, that was when Thyra noticed what she should have seen immediately. The positioning of Hrold's own people wasn't as random as it had first appeared. They had been moving during the conversation, shifting gradually into positions that would allow them to support each other if fighting broke out. More importantly, some faces were missing from the crowd, people who should have been visible but weren't. Astrid caught her eye and offered the slightest of nods toward the trading hall. Whatever plan Ravenshallow's defenders had developed, it was already in motion. The thing about taking hostages, Hrold continued in that same conversational tone, is that you have to be able to control them all simultaneously. Miss even a few, and they become a problem that can unravel your entire operation. Sven's confidence flickered for the first time. My men have secured all the key positions in the settlement, have they? Magnus asked from his position near the longboat. Because I count 8 of your people visible in this crowd, and maybe 6 more positioned around the settlement's perimeter. That's impressive for a raiding party, but not nearly enough to control 200 determined defenders spread across a complex terrain. The psychological warfare was having its effect. Sven's raiders were still dangerous, still numerous enough to inflict terrible casualties, but they were beginning to realize that their position might not be as secure as they had believed. "You're bluffing," Sven said. But his hand had moved to his weapon. "Am I?" Hrold asked. And suddenly the air was filled with a sound that sent chills down every spine, the low, resonant note of a war horn, blown from somewhere high above the settlement. The signal was answered immediately by similar calls from multiple directions, echoing off the valley walls and creating a symphony of defiance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of a community that had not surrendered, had not accepted defeat, and was finally ready to fight for its survival. Sven's carefully orchestrated control began to unravel in real time. His men, who had been confidently managing scattered groups of apparently defeated civilians, suddenly found themselves facing organized resistance from multiple directions. The horn calls were coordinating something, but what? The answer came in the form of smoke. Not the random smoke of cooking fires or workshops, but deliberate columns rising from strategic points around the settlement. Someone was sending signals, coordinating movements, preparing for something that Sven's raiders had not anticipated. "You see," Thyra said calmly, "the problem with taking a settlement through deception rather than direct assault is that you never really know if you've actually taken it. People can pretend to be defeated while planning their real response." She could see Astrid and several other women moving through the crowd with purpose, no longer maintaining the pretense of helpless captivity. They were distributing something, weapons perhaps, or tools that could serve as weapons. "This is what you missed in your planning," Hrold said to Sven. "You understood the economics of controlling a settlement, but you never understood its people. Ravenshollow isn't just a collection of buildings and resources. It's a community, and communities protect themselves." The transformation happening around them was remarkable to witness. People who had been standing in dejected clusters were now moving with clear purpose, responding to signals that had been arranged in advance. Children were disappearing toward predetermined safe areas. Adults were taking positions that would allow them to support the defense. Most telling of all, several of Sven's own men were backing toward each other, trying to consolidate their positions as they realized that their strategic advantage was evaporating. "You planned this," Sven accused, his voice tight with anger. "We prepared for it," Hrold corrected. "The moment we realized there were organized raiders operating in this region, we began developing contingencies. The beacon signals, the coordinated response, the evacuation routes, all of it has been ready for weeks, but we didn't know when or how you would come," Astrid added, speaking for the first time since they had arrived. "So we prepared for multiple scenarios. including the possibility that you would try to take the settlement through. Infiltration rather than direct attack, Thyra felt a surge of admiration for these people who had turned their apparent defeat into an elaborate trap. They had allowed Sven's men to enter Raven's Hollow, to position themselves throughout the settlement, to believe they held all the advantages, and then they had systematically undermined every element of the raiders' control. The question now, Magnus said to Sven, is whether you want to find out what happens when 14 professional raiders try to fight 200 angry defenders on their home ground. The tactical situation had reversed completely. Sven's men were now the ones who were isolated and outnumbered, spread throughout a settlement where every building, every alley, every rooftop could conceal enemies. They had superior individual equipment and training, but they had lost the crucial advantages of surprise and concentration of force. "You're making a mistake," Sven said, his voice carrying the first hint of desperation. "My employer has resources you can't imagine. If you kill his men, if you defy his plans, he will send forces that will turn this entire valley into a wasteland." "Perhaps," Hrold agreed, "but that's a problem for tomorrow. Today's problem is whether you and your men leave Raven's Hollow alive, or whether we send your employer a message written in blood." The moment of final confrontation was approaching, and Thyra could feel the tension building toward an explosive release. But she could also see something else in Sven's expression: calculation, as if he was weighing options that went beyond simple fight or flight. "There is another possibility," Sven said slowly, and his tone suggested he was about to reveal cards he had been holding in reserve. "My employer anticipated that some settlements might prove stubborn. He provided me with alternatives to direct confrontation." The words sent a chill through Thyra's spine. In her experience, people like Sven Blacktooth always had contingency plans, and those plans were usually worse than their primary strategies. "What alternatives?" Astrid demanded. Sven's smile returned, colder and more predatory than before. "Well, for instance, there are the fishing boats that my men have been modifying while we've been talking. Amazing how much damage a few well-placed charges can do to hulls. And then there are the grain stores that have been treated with certain substances that make them highly flammable." The revelation that his men had been sabotaging the settlement's infrastructure while maintaining the pretense of negotiation was like a physical blow. Even if they won the immediate fight, they might find themselves facing starvation and isolation through the coming winter. "But my personal favorite," Sven continued, "is the message that was sent to my employer when we first took control here. A message explaining that if he doesn't receive confirmation of our success by sunset, he should assume we've encountered unexpected resistance and respond appropriately." "What does that mean?" Thyra asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "It means," Sven said with genuine satisfaction, "that reinforcements are already on their way. Enough men to turn Raven's Hollow into a crater if necessary. You may win today's battle, but you've already lost the war." As the implications of his revelation sank in, Thyra realized that their moment of triumph was about to become their greatest peril. They had outmaneuvered Sven's immediate threat, but they had also triggered a response that could destroy everything they were fighting to preserve. The real battle, she understood now, was not going to be fought on the docks of Raven's Hollow. It was going to be fought against time itself, as they raced to find a way to neutralize threats that were already in motion. Guided by enemies they had never seen and might never have the chance to face. The war horn's echo had barely faded when the first arrow whistled past Sven's ear, embedding itself in the wooden post behind him. The shot had come from Eric Whitehair, who had quietly retrieved his bow from their longboat. "That was a warning," Hrold said calmly. "The next one won't be." Sven's hand moved to his sword, but he froze as similar weapons appeared throughout the crowd. Bows, axes, fishing spears, knives held by people who had seemed defeated moments before. His professional raiders suddenly looked very outnumbered. "You have a choice," Thyra said to Sven. "You can try to fight your way out and probably die, or you can help us prevent the larger disaster you've set in motion. Why would I help you?" Sven snarled. "Because your employer's reinforcements won't distinguish between successful subordinates and failed ones. If they arrive expecting a subjugated settlement and find a battlefield, they'll assume your mission failed. Failed mercenaries don't get paid, they get eliminated." The standoff stretched for another heartbeat. Then chaos erupted as one of Sven's men lunged toward Astrid with a drawn blade. His attack was met by coordinated response. 3 fishing spears struck him simultaneously, driven by hands trained through years of working the northern waters. What followed was not a battle, but a series of sharp engagements, as Sven's remaining men tried to break free from a settlement that had become their trap. They fought with professional skill, but they were surrounded and outnumbered on terrain their enemies knew intimately. Thyra found herself pressed against the trading hall wall, watching Hrold move through the melee with deadly efficiency. His size was an advantage, but it was his tactical awareness that proved decisive, positioning allies and isolating enemies with warfare instincts that went beyond mere violence. A raider broke free and charged toward her, apparently deciding that eliminating the source of intelligence might salvage something. Thyra dodged his sword thrust and grabbed a wooden staff from a nearby stall. Not much of a weapon, but better than facing a killer empty-handed. Her opponent was skilled, but made the mistake of underestimating her desperation. When he overextended, trying to finish quickly, she managed to strike his wrist hard enough to make him drop his blade. The staff splintered, but it gave her the opening to drive the broken end into his throat. As the raider collapsed, Thyra realized she had just killed someone. The knowledge should have horrified her, but instead she felt only grim satisfaction. This man had come to murder innocent people for money. His death was justice. The fighting was brutal but brief. Within minutes, half of Sven's men were dead, and the remainder wounded and surrounded. Sven himself had taken a spear thrust through his shoulder and was bleeding heavily as Hrold, and Magnus dragged him toward the trading hall. His iron-capped teeth were bared in pain, but his eyes still held calculating intelligence. "Bind his wounds," Hrold ordered. "We need him alive." "Why?" Astrid demanded, her bow still aimed at Sven's chest. "Because he's our only chance of stopping the reinforcements," Thyra said, kneeling beside the wounded mercenary. "Sven, you said your employer expects confirmation of success. What form?" Sven spat blood and glared at her. "Why should I tell you anything?" "Because if those reinforcements arrive, expecting a conquered settlement, and find evidence of massacre, they'll be unhappy with everyone involved. Including you," she leaned closer. "But if they receive the right signals, if they think everything went according to plan, they might not investigate too closely." Sven understood. A successful mercenary was valuable. A failed one was a liability. "There's a signal mirror," he said grudgingly, hidden in the rocks above the harbor. 3 flashes repeated 5 times means the settlement is secure, and if you don't send that signal, if they don't see it by sunset, they'll assume resistance. Orders are to burn everything and start over. "How many reinforcements?" Hrold asked. 50 men. Real soldiers, equipped for siege work and trained to leave no survivors. The numbers were sobering. Raven's Hollow's defenders had handled infiltrators, but 50 professional soldiers was different. "When do they arrive?" "Tomorrow at dawn." Assuming they received the all-clear signal tonight, they had perhaps 12 hours to prepare for a much larger engagement. "There's something else," Sven added with malicious satisfaction. "The sabotage, it's real. My men placed charges throughout the settlement. If I don't personally disable them before midnight, they'll detonate automatically. Even in defeat, Sven had found a way to threaten them." "Where are they?" Magnus demanded. "Various locations. I'm the only one who knows all of them." Sven coughed blood. "Of course, if something unfortunate were to happen to me, they needed him alive, not just to send false signals, but to prevent their settlement's destruction. As the immediate aftermath settled, Thyra understood the challenge they faced. They had to send convincing signals, locate and disable charges, tend wounded. and prepare defenses, all while maintaining the illusion that everything had gone according to plan. But looking at Raven's Hollow's defenders, bloodied but unbroken, she realized they had advantages Sven's employer never anticipated. They were fighting for home, family, their entire way of life, and they had each other. The hours that followed tested every skill Raven's Hollow's people possessed. Working by torchlight with desperate urgency, they transformed their settlement into a fortress while maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed. Thyra found herself coordinating multiple complex operations, disposing of bodies without leaving traces, cleaning bloodstains from dockstones, positioning defenders to look like normal residents, all while locating explosive charges that could destroy everything they fought to protect. "The mirror signal first," she said to the group in the trading hall. "If we miss that deadline, nothing else matters." Hrold nodded grimly. "Eric, you and Magnus find that mirror. Sven will tell you exactly where it is." Sven, his shoulder roughly bandaged and face pale from blood loss, managed a weak smile. "You're assuming I want those reinforcements to arrive. Have you considered that my situation might be complicated by their presence?" It was a valid point. If Sven had lost control, the arrival of his employer's soldiers might represent as much danger to him as to Raven's Hollow's defenders. "Explain," Hrold demanded. "My contract was to deliver a conquered settlement, not a battlefield," Sven said carefully. "If reinforcements arrive to find evidence of resistance, questions will be asked about my methods. Questions I might not survive answering." Thyra studied his expression. "So you're suggesting we have a common interest in maintaining the illusion of success?" "I'm suggesting my best chance of survival might lie in helping you maintain that illusion long enough for me to renegotiate my situation." It was dangerous, a temporary alliance based on mutual benefit rather than trust. But it was their best chance of buying time to prepare proper defenses. "The charges first," Thyra said decisively. "Show us where they are." What followed was a tense journey through Raven's Hollow's buildings, with Sven directing them to sabotage devices. The explosives were crude but effective. Oil-soaked bundles positioned to create maximum fire damage. "Grain storage, boat-building shed, the main well," Astrid muttered as they worked. "He wasn't planning to just kill people. He wanted to make sure we couldn't survive, even if some escaped." By sunset, they had removed the last charges. Eric and Magnus had found Sven's hidden equipment, a polished bronze mirror on an adjustable stand, positioned to reflect light across the water. 3 flashes, repeated 5 times, Sven instructed. "Wait 30 seconds between sequences and make sure the light is bright enough to be seen clearly." The signaling was nerve-wracking, requiring precise timing. Any mistake could trigger the arrival of reinforcements they were unprepared to face. But Eric's sailor experience served him well. He understood light and distance, the subtle skills needed to communicate across vast spaces. When the final sequence was complete, they waited in tense silence. After several minutes, a single flash appeared on the horizon, acknowledgement that the signal had been received. "That buys us time," Thyra said with relief. "But not much. Even if they believe everything went according to plan, those reinforcements will still arrive tomorrow." The next phase involved turning Raven's Hollow into a trap. Drawing on Hrold's military experience and Thyra's analytical skills, they began positioning defenders and preparing surprises. "They'll expect to find a conquered settlement," Hrold said, as they studied the harbor approach. "Sven's people in control, local residents subdued. We can use those expectations against them." "How?" Astrid asked. "By giving them exactly what they expect to see," Thyra replied, understanding the forming plan. Until it's too late to react, the strategy was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than hiding their preparations, they would hide them in plain sight. The arriving soldiers would see what appeared to be a successful operation. Raiders in control. Local people going about business under armed supervision. What they wouldn't see was that every raider was actually a local defender in captured equipment. Every subdued resident was a fighter waiting for the signal, and every normal activity was positioned to support coordinated assault. It requires perfect timing, Magnus warned. If even one person breaks character too early, the whole deception collapses. And it requires Sven's cooperation, Astrid added skeptically. Actually, Thyra said thoughtfully, it requires him to believe his survival depends on our success. She turned to face Sven directly. Tomorrow morning, you're going to meet those reinforcements and convince them your mission was completed successfully. You're going to guide them into our settlement and help us position them where we want them. And why would I do that? Sven asked. Because if you don't, if you try to warn them or sabotage our plans, we'll make sure they understand exactly how thoroughly you failed. Thyra replied calmly. We'll show them the bodies of your men, describe how fishermen and farmers defeated professional raiders. She leaned closer. How do you think your employer will react to that kind of failure? Sven's face went pale as he considered the implications. On the other hand, Thyra continued, if our plan succeeds, if we can eliminate the reinforcements without revealing what's happened here, you might present it as a victory, a successful conquest that encountered resistance but achieved objectives. It was a seductive offer, the chance to transform failure into qualified success, to survive a disaster that should have ended his career. As dawn approached, Sven made his decision. Whether motivated by self-interest, survival instinct, or genuine conversion, he agreed to help them spring their trap on the reinforcements sailing into Raven's Hollow's harbor. The stage was set for a deception that would either save them or destroy them. Dawn brought with it the sight that would test everything they had, planned and prepared for. 50 longships approaching Raven's Hollow's harbor in perfect formation, their oars cutting through the morning water with military precision. From the settlement's docks, they looked like harbingers of inevitable doom, but Thyra felt no fear as she watched them approach, only a calm certainty that they had done everything possible to prepare for this moment. Sven stood beside her, his wounded arm in a sling, but his posture confident as he prepared to play the role that would determine all their fates. He had cleaned himself up as much as possible, donned the finest clothes they could provide, and practiced his story until it sounded natural. To the arriving soldiers, he would appear to be exactly what they expected, a successful mercenary commander reporting the completion of his mission. Remember, Thyra said quietly as the lead ships drew closer, you're not lying to them. You're simply editing the truth to emphasize the most relevant details. Sven's smile was genuine for perhaps the first time since they had captured him. You would have made an excellent merchant. Lady Thyra, you understand the art of presenting information in its most favorable light. The compliment was oddly touching, coming from a man who had tried to destroy everything she cared about. But it also reminded her how much she had changed since that night when Hrold had found her scavenging beside the docks. The frightened, desperate woman who had been reduced to searching through refuse had become someone capable of orchestrating complex deceptions and commanding the loyalty of seasoned warriors. As the first longship reached the harbor, Sven stepped forward and raised his good arm in greeting. The commander who returned his wave was a hard-faced man in his 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to violence and the confident expectation that his orders would be followed without question. Sven Blacktooth. The commander called out as his ship approached the dock. I trust you have good news for our employer? The best possible news, Captain Bjorn, Sven replied, his voice carrying exactly the right mixture of satisfaction and professional pride. Raven's Hollow is secure and ready for the next phase of operations. Thyra watched from her position near the trading hall as soldiers began disembarking from their ships. They moved with practiced efficiency, but also with the casual confidence of men entering friendly territory. They expected to find a conquered settlement, allies in control, and a local population too. Intimidated to cause trouble, they found exactly what they expected to see. Local people went about their morning routines, under the watchful eyes of armed guards who were Actually, their neighbors and friends in captured equipment. Smoke rose from cooking fires tended by women who kept their heads down and avoided eye contact with the newcomers. Children stayed close to their parents, as children in occupied settlements always did. It was a perfect tableau of successful conquest, and the arriving soldiers accepted it without question. You encountered more resistance than expected, Captain Bjorn observed as he stepped onto the dock, noticing the bandage on Sven's arm and the subtle signs of recent conflict. Some, Sven agreed readily. The local leaders were more stubborn than anticipated, and a few of the younger men had to be discouraged from heroic gestures. But nothing we couldn't handle professionally. Casualties? Minimal on our side. We lost 2 men to accidents during the initial infiltration, but the operation proceeded smoothly. Once we had established control, Sven's version of events was technically accurate while being completely misleading. A masterpiece of selective truth-telling, Captain. Bjorn nodded approvingly. And the local population, cooperative as you can see. Once they understood their situation, most of them accepted the new arrangements without further resistance. A few examples were made, of course, but nothing excessive. As they talked, Bjorn's soldiers were spreading throughout the settlement, taking positions and familiarizing themselves with their new base of operations. They moved with the confidence of occupying forces, never suspecting that they were walking into carefully prepared positions where every apparent advantage was actually a trap waiting to be sprung. Thyra watched the deception unfold with professional appreciation. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed, every potential complication anticipated and prepared for. The arriving soldiers saw exactly what they expected to see, because that was exactly what they had been shown. But beneath the surface of apparent normalcy, Ravenshallow's true defenders were taking their final positions. The signal, when it came, was subtle, a woman hanging laundry on a line in a particular pattern that had been agreed upon the night before. To the casual observer, it was nothing more than a housewife going about her daily chores. To the people who mattered, it was the command to spring their trap. What happened next occurred with such coordinated precision that many of the enemy soldiers never had time to understand what was happening to them. The guards, who had been watching over conquered civilians, suddenly turned their weapons on the new arrivals. The subdued residents produced hidden weapons and moved with the deadly efficiency of people fighting for their homes. The secure settlement became a battlefield where every building, every alley, every rooftop concealed enemies. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical assault. Soldiers who had been confident in their overwhelming advantage suddenly found themselves isolated, confused, and under attack from directions they had never considered. The perfect military formation that had brought them to Ravenshollow became a liability as they struggled to adapt to urban combat. Against opponents who knew every inch of the terrain, the battle was fierce but brief. Professional soldiers fought with skill and determination, but they were caught completely off guard by an enemy that had turned every assumption about the tactical situation into a weapon against them. Within an hour, it was over. Captain Bjorn, bleeding from a head wound and surrounded by the remnants of his command, looked at Sven with the expression of a man who was beginning to understand how thoroughly he had been deceived. "You sold us out," he said simply. "I adapted to changing circumstances," Sven replied calmly. "When it became clear that my original plan was no longer viable, I negotiated new arrangements that better served everyone's interests. Our employer, Sven interrupted, will receive a detailed report explaining how we successfully conquered a heavily defended settlement using innovative tactics that minimized our losses while maximizing strategic advantage. He will be pleased with our efficiency and professionalism." Thyra stepped forward, no longer bothering to maintain her disguise as a conquered resident. "Captain Bjorn, you and your surviving men have a choice. You can accept new employment under terms that will be considerably more generous than your previous arrangements, or you can be delivered to your former employer with an explanation of how your mission failed due to inadequate intelligence and poor planning. The offer was carefully calculated. Professional soldiers valued their lives and their reputations equally, and she was offering them a chance to preserve both while avoiding the consequences of failure. Most of them accepted. In the weeks that followed, Ravenshollow transformed from a target of conquest into the center of a new kind of power in the Northern Territories. The soldiers who had come to subjugate it became its defenders, motivated by better pay, better treatment, and the simple recognition that they were valued for their skills rather than merely exploited for their violence. Sven Blacktooth, revealed to be considerably more adaptable than anyone had anticipated, became the settlement's new military commander, a position that suited his talents while keeping him under careful supervision. His former employer, when he eventually learned the fate of his expedition, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and turned his attention to easier targets. Thyra found herself appointed to Ravenshollow's council, where her skills in analysis and negotiation proved invaluable in managing the settlement's expanded influence. The merchant's daughter, who had once scavenged for scraps in the refuse, now helped determine policy for a community that had become a regional power. But perhaps the most significant change was in herself. Standing on the harbour dock one evening, watching the sun set over waters that were now safe for her people's fishing boats, Thyra reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" Hrold asked, joining her at the water's edge. "The life you had before, the family you lost." "I regret their deaths," Thyra replied thoughtfully. "I will always mourn what they suffered, what we all lost, but regret the path that led me here. Regret finding people worth fighting for, causes worth defending, a place where I can make a difference." She looked at him with eyes that held peace rather than the desperate hunger he had first seen beside the refuse barrels. "No, I think my father would be proud of the person I've become, not because of the wealth or position I've gained, but because I learned to use the skills he taught me to protect something larger than myself." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thyra Eriksdottir, survivor, strategist, and defender of Ravenshollow, felt truly at home for the first time since her world had burned. She had lost everything once, but in doing so, she had discovered what she was truly capable of becoming, and that, she realized, made all the pain and struggle worthwhile. Sometimes you had to lose everything to find out who you really were. Sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of a much better one. In the harbour, safe beneath the protection of people who valued courage over birth and merit over privilege, the longships rocked gently at anchor, no longer instruments of conquest, but symbols of a community strong enough to turn enemies into allies and disasters into opportunities. It was, Thyra thought with quiet satisfaction, exactly the kind of impossible victory her father would have appreciated. The most profitable transactions, he had always told her, were the ones that left everyone involved better off than they had been before, even when the currency was measured in lives rather than silver.